Okay, so we're talking about pattern and texture this week, but also let's talk a little bit about what is due. So let me pull up a, I'll bring up a calendar. So the major the icon project was turned in this week, and then we've got the formal critique. So the formal critique on this is feedback to your peers, and it's showing that it's due this weekend, but you really have some extra time. Like I usually don't grade these for a week or so, so you have some extra time on getting your critiques done. And then for those of you in a group, your group progress is due this week, and then um, getting ready for the creative practice, the illusion of space. We'll talk about that a little bit next week. So I'm going to throw a question out here at the beginning, and you can either answer through voice or on the chat. So to this to this point in this class, do you think that you are learning something that will be useful to you in whatever career you're going to do? And then what you're learning, so let's if you're learning something, so what specifically do you think has helped you or just one thing, pick one thing that you think has helped you that will help you in your career. And once again, you can either say this out loud or throw
Um,
it into the chat. Go ahead.
so one thing that I always seem to find interesting is hearing other people's thoughts and perspectives on art pieces. I've talked about this before. Pretty sure I talked about this in class, but I used to tutor English at Slick, and when you're talking about narrative projects, um, you can write a story or even film a movie or whatever, and you can have an intention for the way someone is going to take it, but that's not necessarily how that's going to be taken. And so to me, it's just always interesting to get more perspectives from other people on the same thing that we're all looking at. Um, I think that just helps to have a broader perspective of how other people view it too, and not just yourself.
That's great. Yeah, that's true. It's important. And something, so the interesting story that I've heard where I can't remember if it was on a podcast from Malcolm Gladwell or are all of you familiar with Malcolm Gladwell? Let's pull up. Oh. So, and the reason I want to talk about Malcolm Gladwell is on a podcast, or maybe it was in one of his books. I don't know. He had this segment on memory and people's memory. So here's a picture of. I'll bring him up just here on Google, and then it shows the books that he's written. And he started out as a reporter, I think for the New Yorker. Sorry, not for the New Yorker, the New York Times, or maybe it was the Washington Post. And then I think he could see that he wasn't going to make that there wasn't going to be as much money in that as the internet came around, and so he started writing books. I think while he was probably a reporter, and then he's got into podcasting, and so he's got a unique perspective. So the first thing that I read from him was David and Goliath, and his perspective on this is he explains about David and Goliath in the book that we always talk about David and Goliath, and so he took a new view on this story that he had done some research, and he makes the case that Goliath was had a medical condition that because he was that made him grow really large, but by that time he was, for all intents and purposes, blind. And so, and then the other thing is, I don't think that most of us understand about warfare back then was there were several different types of warriors. So one of the warriors was hand to hand combat. You had a sword, and whoever was the strongest was going to win that battle. But then there was archers and people, or like David slinging the rock. Those people were better at distance. And so Goliath was really an up in your face kind of fight kind of guy, but because of this, they suspect he had this condition that he was really blind and really couldn't move that fast. And so up close, he was so much bigger that he would do just damage. But somebody like David, it really was not a fair fight because David was flipping rocks at him from a distance, and Goliath had no chance. And so it's an interesting perspective that he brings. And so Malcolm Gladwell, that's kind of his one of the things that he does is bring a new perspective. And so um, in one of these podcasts that he was doing, he was talking about memory and how that they did a study right after 9/11. They did a study, they talked to people, and they had these social scientists said, hey, let's do this experiment. So they brought these people in, they had them write down where they were and what they were doing when the attacks on the World Trade Center occurred. And so they had them write them down in their own handwriting. And then a year later, they brought them back and had them write down the same thing. Where were you? What were you doing? It should be a simple thing. But some people were in different states. They had remembered being in a different place than they were when they'd written down like a year before. And so I heard this and I thought, can I really trust my memory? But he didn't really talk about why people did that. But just this last week, I was listening to, there's a thing that it's out there, it's called Masterclass. And so me and my brother bought it for our family this Christmas. So we have like a year worth of this Masterclass, and mostly because I wanted to listen to Malcolm Gladwell. But he was saying in there, he talks about that experience, but he was saying that somewhere someone had said people change their memories, or we all change our memories based on the assumption that we are the hero in our own narrative. And so, like, this is kind of a long explanation for this, but what Leon's saying is everyone has their own perspective, and then everyone has their own bias to, especially towards memory. And so, so it's such an interesting thing because a lot of times I'm talking to people and I say, people do things based on what is going on in their own universe. And so we need to understand what's going on in people's universes, just like Leon said, is we need feedback from people to tell us about that. But I just want to add one more layer to that is people are going to remember what makes them kind of the hero in their own story, which I just think is because I'd heard about this memory thing, and it's so funny because we used to we still joke about how my dad would tell stories, and we were all there, but it was such a different experience for him than it was for the rest of us. We're like, I don't think it really happened that way. But now that with that new perspective that I got from Malcolm Gladwell this week, my dad's creating a narrative where he is the hero in his own story. And Malcolm Gladwell also said this in his masterclass. He's like, I am really reluctant to talk about myself because all of us, if we're going biographical, we're expecting someone, like if I'm telling a story about something in my life, it's got to be great, like George Washington or Abraham Lincoln or something, because those are the biographies that we hear from these people. Like if you're familiar with David McCullough, you should read some of his stuff on history. He makes people out to be heroes, and so I think we are all doing that to a certain extent with the things that we remember. And so I think as a designer, we need to take that into consideration. Is like, how can we make people remember themselves as the hero in whatever we're trying to produce? I know it's another little thing, but take that take that into consideration as people are critiquing your work, that they have their bias on that. And I always think it's such a good experience to get someone else's view on what we think is the view of the world. And so, Leon, that is so good that we really need to really dig into that as a designer. That Dayton, that is a good point. So I think this is I think we remember the embarrassment, but for at least for me, if I'm telling a story where it was embarrassing for me, I'm going to try to create this story in such a way that it doesn't make me as bad as I was, because I have done some things that I am not proud of. That if I was, a lot of times I just wouldn't tell the story, but if I had to bring up the story, I may leave some parts out about that, even though I remember the embarrassment. So, so as a designer, we need to think about that. Like Leon said, we really need to know who our audience is and the way they think. And we're talking about icons. We're going through this icon design process. And I like the concept that someone says the brand, and a lot of times just your logo, your icon, is a conversation you are having with your audience. And so I know we've already gone through the icon project, but think about that as um, you evaluate the icons, because we're going to do that this coming week, or during this week we will do that. So does someone else have something that, I mean, I like, Jong, I like what you're saying about the things that we've learned in this class help us to understand how we need to, and it's really in some ways it's manipulate the audience into seeing what we want them to see. So, but Leon, I think that's great. It's the feedback, because the more feedback we get, the better we can tell our story in a way that we want to be, or tell our story in a way that we want it to be perceived. So now onto the pattern and texture. We'll go through this pretty quick. But we talk about pattern and texture, and so this is interesting. We're only seeing one picture here, but I would like to see more of these, because it sounds like it's a Chronicle Books. It sounds like there's more than just this one picture of teenagers in their rooms. So I will ask this question: Why would we use a pattern in a design? What are some of the reasons? There's no right or wrong answers here, but think about this, why we would use a pattern. We're talking about pattern, but why would we use a pattern?
Having a pattern can help someone relate to the image.
Yeah, that's great. So what are some other reasons? Patterns, Sky, that's good input. It can give a feeling of movement. And that's good comment there about it. It can add weight to the. You say weight there, but maybe stability too. Got these patterns. What are some other things like the pattern in this? Interesting. They've overlaid these shapes. My question is for this MC Escher painting here is or drawing. How many versions did he come up with? What did he do in his sketching beforehand to get this to work?
He put all of the shapes into, oh goodness, one, two, three, four, five, into hexagonal shapes to try and keep the pattern consistent.
Yeah. So what's interesting in if you're using Photoshop, you can they have you can create your own patterns like this, repeating patterns. And so that's I think Photoshop is one of those is a tool that you can use to create these uh, kind of endless patterns. It's kind of fun to see the tools that Photoshops give you to do this. But this was MC Escher was way before Photoshop, so yeah, Scott, I think that's a good. He probably did. Now that we're looking at this, if you look at the hexagon here, octagon, hexagon. It says it right there. I wonder if he started with that and then built the shapes. I wonder if when he, I wonder how many iterations he went through before he got to this hexagon rule that he's using. So along with pattern is texture. So the interesting thing with this is they're giving us some examples here. This is where I would like to get up closer on this one to see. I can't. The one thing that's tough with this on the texture part is, I wonder if we put this stuff some on something and then took a picture, or if this is actually on, because it's hard to tell even with the shadows if that texture is actually on the. But it does say pebbles and sand on 4 plywood panes. Interesting here, the photographer's perspective. And what's fun here with the texture is, even though this is 2-dimensional, you know, I, at least for me, I know what that would feel like to go up there and touch that. So this is something, as a designer, like Leon said earlier, it is a way that we can communicate an idea more quickly if we're using texture. So I don't know, something interesting about Van Gogh, and you cannot tell it from here, and they need to. So Van Gogh, I think, when he was doing these paintings, he would put so much paint on the canvas that he would use the back of his brush to bring texture. I mean, just the handle part of the brush to bring texture into his paintings. And so this is, that particular style is was really unique. I mean, I think some of the other impressionists were doing something where there was more texture to it than the masters. Like Rembrandt, I've seen a couple of Rembrandts, and it's so interesting that the Rembrandts are so smooth. So once they got the picture finished, they continued to lacquer it to the point where if you go to the side, you can't see any texture. You can't see the brushstrokes. But the complete opposite is Van Gogh, where sometimes he'll have, it's, a couple of millimeters, or maybe, I wouldn't say a full centimeter, but it is a couple of millimeters off of the canvas. He's got so much paint on there. And so a lot of what we're looking at in a lot of his paintings, it looks like it might be he's painted lines, but no, it's just the texture. And then this one too, I think just the way that this one's painted, and we see this in every chapter, but the texture on this one definitely, there's a lot of paint on this. And Lichtenstein here, the way he's trying to do this is he's trying to, just in the 2 dimensions, trying to bring some of that texture into the design. It's interesting of this collage on paper, and I think Varag, back in the day when she created the first assignment for this class, with ripping out pages in a magazine, I think that there's a textural aspect to that assignment. You can kind of see here. And then some of the students and some of you in this class have even used different types of textures to bring to make that collage. Interesting. It's interesting. We've got this one, this painting again. So it's interesting we get to this point, but the texture, because of what they've done with the glass, that's another one that at least for me, I don't need to actually reach out and touch that. I know what that would feel like if I actually touched it. And without thinking about it, I know, I think most of us know what that would feel like. Because we've reached out and touched something that was similar to that. So it's another one of those ways that you can communicate a lot through doing something like that. If any of you've ever done watercolor, and I've just briefly dabbled around with watercolor occasionally, but I saw a watercolor one time that somebody had done really well. This was down at Utah Tech because they have an art gallery and they change the art all the time. But they had a watercolor show, and someone had a boat on like the ocean, and it looked like the water was shiny. And if you've done any watercolor, you know that the paper it just was such an illusion to me how or so amazing to me that the illusion that the artist had created by making the water seemed shiny. This is before cell phones, and so I should have. And I hope that you're all familiar. If you haven't heard this trompe l'oeil, that's how to pronounce that. The trompe l'oeil is trying to make something look real when it's not, or look like it's 3D. There is. Well, actually, I think what trompe l'oeil is making something look like something else. I'm gonna look for. There was in a. I'm gonna look to see if I can find this. Okay, so here's one of them, and there's. If you look around, you can. So, what does this look like? If you saw this somewhere, what would you expect that bag to be made out of?
Maybe leather.
Right. I'm gonna see if I can find another one. Here's another one. So the crazy thing about these, and I've seen these in museums, so these, it's not unique. These are made out of ceramic. They've made the ceramic look like leather. This is, I think this is the most amazing version of trompe l'oeil is, and the fact that there's so much out there. Like I'm looking, here's another one. We'll see if we can get this one a little bit bigger. And it with photographs, especially this one that's not a great photograph, you cannot tell. And even when you get up close to check some of these out, it's really hard. Like, and they're always in a museum, and so you can't touch them. But it's so funny. You're like, I think that's leather. I don't think that's ceramics. So this, I think, is a bad example of trompe l'oeil. I think they need to get one of these ceramic bags in there. Oh, so that's it. That's it for this week. Oh, Dayton, that's true. Is it cake? I saw. I think Jim Gaffigan. He's like, I think we need to make a new reality show and have cake on one side, and then a dead relative on the other side, and see if people can tell the difference. uh, Jim Gaffigan's funny. So, that's it for this week. Thanks everybody for joining. I want you to think about next week. I'm going to ask that same question. If there's something in this class that's helped you see, so what it is, and then how it's helped you see something differently as you've looked at art or design since the class started. So that'll be for next week. So thanks for joining, everyone. We'll catch you next week.
Have a great week.